The Ottoman Empire, stretching across 3 continents at its peak, ruled for over 600 years, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Balkans to North Africa. The Ottomans controlled diverse peoples, religions, and cultures. But an empire of such scale could not rest on diplomacy and tolerance alone. To hold power over millions, they relied on fear. Ottoman law was based on a blend of Islamic sharia, local customs, and the sultan's decrees. This produced a system of justice that could be measured and merciful at times, but also unimaginably cruel when the empire needed to assert dominance. Punishment was not simply about correcting crime, it was about displaying power. Every execution, every mutilation, every public humiliation was a message. The sultan's authority was absolute, and defiance meant agony. While Europe imagined the Ottomans as the terrible Turk, a monstrous caricature, the reality was both more complex and more terrifying. The empire's punishments were not random acts of savagery. They were carefully calibrated tools of control, honed over centuries to keep order, crush rebellion, and remind subjects that their lives hung on the sultan's will. We will walk through some of the most horrifying punishments the Ottomans inflicted, from impalement and strangulation to bizarre tortures designed to humiliate and terrify. And as always, we will ask, if you lived under the shadow of the crescent banner, would you survive? The philosophy of Ottoman punishment: mercy, terror, and absolute power. Before we explore the grisly details, we must first understand the philosophy behind Ottoman punishment. Unlike the Assyrians, who glorified cruelty openly, the Ottomans wove their punishments into a legal and religious framework that justified violence as both justice and sacred duty. The Ottoman Sultan was not just a monarch, he was considered the shadow of God on earth, a ruler divinely appointed to protect Islam and ensure order. To defy the Sultan was not merely treason, it was blasphemy. Punishments, therefore, carried religious weight. Executions and mutilations were framed not as cruelty, but as acts of divine justice carried out by the Sultan's authority. Just as Assyria linked cruelty to Ashur, the Ottomans linked punishment to Allah's will. Ottoman justice came from 2 sources: sharia law, derived from the Quran and Islamic tradition; Qanun, secular laws issued by the Sultan. This dual system allowed flexibility. Theft, adultery, and blasphemy might be punished under sharia. Rebellion, treason, and political crimes fell under the Sultan's decrees. In both cases, the Sultan's word was final. This framework gave the empire an air of legitimacy. A thief might lose his hand in accordance with sharia, while a rebellious vizier might be strangled in accordance with the Sultan's will. Both were seen as lawful, even holy acts. Like many empires before them, the Ottomans used punishment as theatre. Executions were often staged in public squares, bazaars, or at city gates where crowds could watch. The more prominent the criminal, the grander the spectacle. This served 2 purposes: deterrence. A hanging in the marketplace reminded every passerby that crime was dangerous. Propaganda. The sight of a rebel vizier's body told the people that even the highest ranks were not beyond the Sultan's reach. Interestingly, the Ottomans also cultivated an image of mercy. While cruel punishments existed, pardons and displays of clemency were equally part of the Sultan's toolkit. By sparing a criminal or reducing a punishment, the ruler could project generosity. By executing mercilessly, he could project power. This balance made Ottoman justice unpredictable. A man brought before the court could walk away free or headless. That uncertainty amplified the fear. At its heart, Ottoman punishment was about control. An empire that stretched from the Balkans to Baghdad could not afford constant rebellion. Fear had to be universal, cutting across language, religion, and culture. By making examples of criminals, rebels, and political enemies, the Ottomans maintained stability without needing to station armies in every village. Terror traveled faster than soldiers. Impalement, the spear of terror. If there is one punishment most synonymous with Ottoman cruelty in the popular imagination, it is impalement. The very word conjures horror: a sharpened stake, a human body forced upon it, and a slow, agonizing death that could last for hours or even days. Though not uniquely Ottoman, Persians, Assyrians, and medieval Europeans had used it too. Under the Ottomans, it became both a political tool and a chilling warning to rebels, criminals, and enemies of the state. Impalement was brutally simple. A wooden stake, often 10 to 15 feet long, was sharpened at one end and planted firmly in the ground. The victim was forced down onto it, usually through the rectum, genitals, or abdomen. The stake pierced upwards, sometimes carefully angled so it avoided vital organs, prolonging life. The victim was then left upright, their body slowly sliding down the stake under its own weight until death finally came from shock, blood loss, or organ failure. Some died within hours, others lingered in unimaginable agony for days. Impalement was often done en masse, transforming fields and roadsides into forests of writhing bodies. Outside city walls, at crossroads, or near rebel villages, impaled victims became part of the landscape. Travelers could not avoid seeing them. The Ottomans ensured that the sight of punishment traveled further than their soldiers ever could. For villagers, the horror was unforgettable. Bodies left to rot for weeks, picked apart by crows, while children and farmers passed by daily. Impalement was not just for criminals, it was a weapon of empire. Villages that resisted Ottoman authority might see their leaders impaled in public as an example. Captured soldiers from rival states, especially those who defied surrender, might be impaled to terrify others. Highway robbers, murderers, and bandits often faced the stake to deter lawlessness in remote provinces. It was never just about killing the condemned. It was about sending a message: disobedience leads not to swift death, but to days of torment. The punishment's most infamous association actually comes from the Ottoman frontier in Eastern Europe. Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula, learned impalement from his Ottoman overlords during his youth as a hostage in their court. When he later rebelled against them, he used impalement on a staggering scale, creating forests of the impaled, so vast that Ottoman armies turned back in horror. Ironically, Vlad's brutality was born of Ottoman brutality. This grim exchange shows how impalement was not just a punishment, but a cultural export of fear, seared into the collective imagination of Europe. Ottoman impalements were carefully staged. Victims might be paraded through the streets first, mocked and beaten, before being dragged to the stake. Sometimes they were stripped naked, their suffering made more humiliating. Crowds gathered, not only to witness the punishment, but to participate in the fear. The condemned were not hidden away in prisons. Their agony was made into a performance, a theater of terror designed to bind entire communities in obedience. Impalement worked because it was unforgettable. Unlike hanging or decapitation, which ended quickly, impalement turned death into a prolonged nightmare. The screams carried across fields. The sight lingered in memory. Parents used it as a warning to children: stay obedient, or you'll end up on a stake. It was punishment that lived not just in the body, but in the imagination, a fear that endured long after the corpses had rotted away. Though impalement was not a prescribed Islamic punishment, the Ottomans framed it as a defense of divine order. Rebels were not just criminals, they were enemies of the faith, enemies of the state, and therefore worthy of extraordinary suffering. By elevating victims high on stakes, their bodies thrust toward the sky, Ottomans symbolically displayed them to God, as if to say, here is the fate of those who defy his empire. Though the Ottomans eventually curtailed the practice in later centuries, impalement left a lasting legacy. In Europe, tales of the terrible Turk often focused on this punishment, painting the empire as a land of exotic cruelty. In the Balkans, where it was most often used, the memory endured as folklore, blending history with nightmare. To this day, the word impaler carries an association with horror that traces directly back to Ottoman justice. Strangulation with the silk cord, death in the sultan's shadow. If impalement was the punishment of terror for commoners and rebels, strangulation with the silk cord was the punishment of the palace. Quiet, bloodless, and chillingly ceremonial, it was the execution method most often reserved for viziers, princes, and high officials who had fallen from the sultan's favor. This was not death in the market square. This was death in the shadow of power. The Ottomans had a peculiar rule. It was forbidden to spill the blood of a royal or nobleman. To kill them with the sword or axe was considered dishonorable, almost sacrilegious. Strangulation provided a way to end their lives without shedding blood. The silk cord was chosen because it was strong, silent, and, in a grim way, symbolic of refinement. To die by silk was both a privilege and a humiliation. When a high-ranking official fell from grace, the process unfolded with chilling ritual. The condemned might be invited to the palace under pretense of a meeting. 2 palace guards, often mute executioners, entered silently, carrying the cord. The sultan's order was absolute. Once given, there was no appeal. The silk cord was slipped around the neck. Sometimes the condemned resisted, sometimes they accepted fate with dignity. Death came quickly, but not instantly. This ritual was both personal and terrifying. Unlike public executions, strangulation was intimate. The victim looked into the eyes of his executioners as life slipped away. Perhaps the most infamous victims were Ottoman princes. To prevent civil war, Ottoman sultans practiced fratricide, the killing of brothers upon ascending the throne. After a sultan's death, his sons raced to claim the throne. The victor ordered his brothers strangled with the silk cord, eliminating rivals before they could challenge him. One sultan, Mehmed III, is said to have strangled 19 of his brothers in a single night. Their small bodies, some mere children, were carried out of the palace wrapped in cloth, victims of a brutal system where survival meant killing your kin. Later, the practice softened into the cafes or cage system where princes were locked in isolation rather than executed outright. But for centuries, silk cord strangulation ensured that Ottoman succession was soaked in fear and death. Grand viziers, the empire's most powerful officials, often fell victim to this silent death. A vizier who lost the sultan's trust might be summoned for what seemed like a normal meeting, only to find executioners waiting. Their bodies were sometimes displayed afterward, but the act itself was usually private, a palace secret whispered in corridors. This secrecy added to the fear. Any vizier, no matter how powerful, knew that his career could end not in triumph, but with a silk cord tightening around his throat. Unlike the screams of impalement, strangulation was silent. No cries, no spectacle, just the hiss of silk and the struggle of a man denied air. This silence was itself a form of terror. Public executions were warnings to the masses, but strangulations were warnings to the elite. It reminded courtiers that their fate depended entirely on the sultan's will. One day they dined with him, the next they might die by his order. Such uncertainty kept the court loyal, fearful, and obedient. The silk cord embodied the precarious nature of Ottoman politics. It reminded everyone, from princes to viziers, that proximity to power was also proximity to death. Would you rise high in the court, knowing that every step toward influence brought you closer to the cord? Would you live quietly, avoiding the palace, or gamble your life for glory? For many, ambition outweighed fear, but countless courtiers paid the ultimate price, their breath snuffed out by silk in the name of loyalty and order. Mutilations and branding, punishing the body without killing it. Death was final, but for the Ottomans, sometimes death was too merciful. For lesser crimes, or when they wished to leave behind a living warning, they turned to mutilation and branding. These punishments ensured that criminals carried their guilt not only in their hearts, but on their bodies, living testaments to the sultan's justice. Mutilation served several purposes. A thief without a hand was a public reminder of what happened to lawbreakers. A branded forehead or a scarred face marked a man forever as dishonored. Disfigured criminals could not easily return to rebellion or crime. This was punishment as permanent stigma. Unlike prison, which might be forgotten after release, mutilation turned the body into a lifelong sentence. One of the most common mutilations was the cutting off of noses and ears. This practice, often applied to thieves, deserters, or rebels, served both symbolic and practical functions. The nose was the mark of honor. To lose it was to lose one's dignity. Ears made the punishment visible from a distance. A man without ears was instantly identifiable as a criminal. In some cases, captured rebels had their noses and ears cut off en masse, then released to stagger back to their villages. Their mutilated faces were walking advertisements of Ottoman power. For political rivals, the Ottomans sometimes used blinding instead of execution. In Islamic tradition, a blind man could not rule. By blinding a rebellious prince or governor, the Ottomans removed him as a threat without shedding his blood. This punishment carried both cruelty and irony. The victim lived, but forever in darkness, a shadow of his former self. Branding was another favorite punishment. A red-hot iron was pressed to the skin, leaving permanent marks. The face, arms, or chest might be seared, the scars serving as eternal reminders. Some criminals were branded with specific marks. A thief might bear a symbol indicating his crime. Others received more general burns, the brand less about identity than about pain and humiliation. Imagine carrying such a mark through life, no chance of hiding, every glance from a neighbor, a reminder of your fall. Perhaps the most brutal mutilation was castration, inflicted on slaves, prisoners of war, or rebels. Castrated men were often forced into service as eunuchs, guarding harems or serving in palace bureaucracy. This punishment combined agony, lifelong disability, and social stigma. A eunuch could rise to positions of trust within the palace, but he did so at the cost of his manhood. For rebels, castration was a fate worse than death, stripping them not only of dignity, but of legacy. In cases of blasphemy, treasonous speech, or seditious rumor spreading, the Ottomans sometimes punished by cutting out the tongue. This was punishment as silence. The condemned lived, but could never again speak against the state. In a society where oral tradition and speech carried immense weight, tongue removal was both physical and symbolic execution. Mutilations were often paired with slavery. A mutilated captive could be branded and sold, his scars making him cheaper and condemning him to harder labor. Thus, punishment served not only as deterrence, but as economic exploitation. The body of the criminal became both warning and commodity. As with executions, mutilations were often public. Markets, squares, and palace gates became theaters of pain. Crowds watched as noses were sliced, ears hacked, or brands pressed. The purpose was not simply to hurt the criminal, but to sear fear into the crowd. Each gasp, each horrified cry was part of the performance. Europeans who traveled through Ottoman lands often wrote about mutilations with horror, using them to depict the empire as barbaric. Yet, within the empire, such punishments were seen as just, lawful measures designed to keep order. The scars of these punishments lived on in stories, proverbs, and even physical remains. Villages remembered the earless rebels, the noseless thieves, the tongueless liars. The Ottoman state did not need prisons filled with criminals. The criminals themselves became prisons of flesh. Drowning, crushing, and exotic executions, rare but terrifying methods. While impalement and mutilation were horrifyingly common, the Ottomans also employed a set of rare and exotic punishments reserved for special circumstances. These were not the everyday tools of law, but extraordinary displays of terror, chosen when the empire wished to make an unforgettable statement. One of the most chilling punishments was drowning, often used for members of the royal harem or disgraced palace figures. Because spilling the blood of high-ranking women was forbidden, the Ottomans turned to water. Victims were tied in weighted sacks and dropped into the Bosporus under the cover of night. Sometimes cats or dogs were tied inside the sack with them, turning drowning into a grotesque struggle before death. This was punishment as silence. No screams in the marketplace, no bodies on display, only ripples across the dark waters. Yet everyone in Istanbul knew what those ripples meant. Another punishment, rarely used but deeply feared, was death by crushing. Victims were pinned beneath massive stones or slabs, slowly suffocated under the weight. This punishment carried heavy symbolism. The empire itself was pressing down, crushing the life of the disobedient. In some accounts, stones were added one by one, prolonging the agony and turning the execution into a drawn-out spectacle. For the Janissaries, the elite core of the empire, punishment could take unusual forms. A disobedient soldier might be tied in a sack and beaten by his comrades before being thrown into a river. In this way, the army itself enacted the punishment, binding its members through shared violence. This ritualized drowning blurred the line between execution and initiation, a reminder that loyalty to the core was stronger than loyalty to life itself. Rebellions and treason sometimes provoked creative cruelty. Chroniclers describe rebels being sewn into animal skins and left under the sun to die of suffocation and heat. Others were tied to camels or horses and dragged through the streets until their bodies were unrecognizable. These methods were rare, but their rarity made them terrifying. They broke the pattern of punishment. A thief might expect mutilation, but a rebel could expect anything, even a death so strange that it defied imagination. For some enemies, especially political ones, the Ottomans turned to starvation in cages. Rather than swift execution, the victim was confined in a small enclosure and left to waste away, their cries ignored by passers-by. This was punishment by neglect, cruelty stretched across weeks. Unlike impalement or strangulation, there was no single moment of agony, but a long, slow descent into death. What made these exotic punishments especially powerful was their unpredictability. Sometimes they were staged publicly, rebels dragged behind horses, drowned soldiers thrown from bridges. Other times, they were secret, whispered about but never seen. The secrecy magnified the fear. People wondered, if the Sultan could drown a vizier in the Bosporus without anyone seeing, what else might he do in the shadows? Because they were rare, these punishments lived long in memory. A villager might forget a thief's hand being cut off, but no one forgot a rebel sewn into a camel's hide. Travelers spread the stories far beyond Ottoman borders, fueling Europe's image of the empire as a land of exotic terror. These rare punishments were less about law than about theatre, acts of psychological warfare that magnified the power of the state by showing it could kill not only with cruelty, but with imagination. Public spectacle and the power of fear. Every empire relies on power, but the Ottomans knew that power was not only military or political, it was psychological. A punishment carried out in silence, in private, reached only the condemned, but a punishment carried out in public, with all the theatre of ritual and cruelty, reached thousands. The Ottomans perfected the spectacle of punishment, turning executions and mutilations into staged events that bound their diverse empire through fear. The empire's punishments often took place in public spaces such as marketplaces, where merchants, villagers, and travelers gathered, mosque courtyards, ensuring that justice was seen as sanctioned by religion, and city gates, so that everyone entering or leaving was greeted by the sight of corpses or mutilated criminals. The setting was deliberate. These were places of traffic and community where the maximum number of people could watch. A man hanged in the bazaar was not only executed, he was made into a message for thousands. The Ottomans, like many empires, left bodies on display long after execution. Impaled rebels rotted in fields, their stench a reminder of disobedience. Thieves who were hanged remained swinging from the gallows for days, blackened by the sun. These corpses were not hidden. They were billboards of fear, designed to outlast the act of execution itself. Some punishments began with processions. Criminals were paraded through the streets, mocked and humiliated before reaching the site of execution. This turned their downfall into a civic ritual where the community participated in the spectacle. Children jeered, merchants spat, soldiers struck the condemned as they passed. The execution itself was only the climax of a drama that began the moment the prisoner left his cell. The crowd was not passive. They shouted, cursed, sometimes even pelted the condemned with stones or filth. Their participation bound them into the empire's justice system. By forcing subjects to witness and sometimes participate, the Ottomans ensured that punishment was not just an act of the state, but a communal reaffirmation of order. When high-ranking viziers or governors were executed, the spectacle was even grander. Sometimes their heads were displayed in Istanbul, placed at the gates of the palace or mounted on pikes. Crowds thronged to see them, proof that even the mighty were not immune. This sent a clear message. If even a grand vizier could be strangled or beheaded, what hope did commoners have if they defied the sultan? In some cases, executions were timed to coincide with festivals or religious gatherings, ensuring maximum visibility. Imagine celebrating a holiday only to witness a public beheading or impalement. Joy and terror mingled in one memory. This fusion of celebration and cruelty reinforced the idea that punishment was woven into the very fabric of society. These spectacles were not only for Ottoman subjects, they were also aimed at foreigners. Ambassadors, merchants, and travelers carried tales of Ottoman punishments back to Europe, where they fueled the image of the terrible Turk. Thus, the spectacle served as international propaganda. It warned both subjects and rivals that the Ottoman Sultan ruled not only by armies, but by fear. Public punishments left deep scars in memory. European chroniclers described them with fascination, sometimes exaggerating them into grotesque tales. Within the empire, they were remembered in stories, proverbs, and warnings passed down through generations. The spectacle was effective. It kept millions in line, binding them not with love for the Sultan, but with fear of what awaited those who disobeyed. The decline of cruelty, how Ottoman punishments evolved over time. The Ottoman Empire was built on fear. For centuries, impalements, mutilations, strangulations, and public executions kept its people in line. Yet by the 18th and 19th centuries, the world was changing, and with it, the Ottomans themselves. The punishments that had once defined their rule began to soften, fade, or disappear altogether. By the late Ottoman period, many subjects of the empire, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Kurds, and Turks alike, began to see brutal punishments as archaic and excessive. While fear could suppress rebellion, it could not generate loyalty. Moreover, the empire had grown weary of its own cruelty. Constant spectacles of mutilation and impalement created resentment, not stability. Local uprisings and simmering discontent showed that terror alone could not hold a vast, multi-ethnic state together forever. Ironically, while the Ottomans had long justified punishments with religious authority, reformers increasingly turned to Islamic principles of mercy and proportional justice to argue against brutality. Clerics and jurists began to emphasize Quranic injunctions about forgiveness, restitution, and balance. Punishments like amputation or stoning became rarer as judges found ways to issue fines, exiles, or reduce sentences instead. The law was slowly shifting from fear as dominance to justice as governance. Perhaps the greatest pressure came from outside. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was watching the Ottomans closely. European travelers, diplomats, and newspapers often exaggerated Ottoman cruelty to paint the empire as barbaric. justifying Western meddling in its affairs. Ottoman leaders realized that continued use of gruesome punishments tarnished their image on the international stage. To survive in the age of diplomacy and empires, they needed to appear civilized. Thus began a deliberate effort to abolish the most horrifying practices. Impalement, once so common, virtually disappeared. Strangulation with the silk cord, once used even for princes, was abandoned in favor of exile or discreet execution. Public mutilations dwindled. The real turning point came with the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century. Seeking to modernize and centralize the empire, Ottoman rulers adopted European-style legal codes. Punishments shifted toward imprisonment, exile, and fines rather than mutilation or torture. Courts were reorganized. Juries and written law began to replace arbitrary verdicts. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman Empire tried to align itself with the modern world. The age of impalement and branding was ending. But even as these reforms took hold, the memory of Ottoman punishments lingered. Villagers still whispered about impaled rebels. Europeans continued to write lurid tales of silk cord strangulations and harem drownings. In the Western imagination, the terrible Turk remained alive long after the empire itself had moved on. The myths of cruelty outlived the cruelty itself. The decline of brutal punishments raises an important question. Did the Ottomans weaken themselves by abandoning fear? Some argued that without terror, the empire lost one of its strongest tools of control. Others saw the reforms as necessary, a chance to build legitimacy and respect. History suggests that terror alone cannot sustain power forever. Fear is corrosive. It creates obedience, but never loyalty. The moment terror softens, the suppressed hatred erupts. By the 19th century, nationalist revolts across the Balkans and Middle East proved that fear had already lost its grip. By the empire's collapse in the early 20th century, the most horrifying punishments were gone. Yet their legacy lived on, in folklore, in European propaganda, and in the memory of centuries of fear. Even today, when people speak of the Ottoman Empire, they recall not only its grandeur, art, and architecture, but also its cruelty. The silk cord, the stake, the mutilated thief, these remain among its most enduring images.